Welcome back, Algebra 2 students. We are still on the topic of key features of functions. Yesterday, we went over the first two key features. Today, we're going to go over a third. So our learning target is the same. I can apply the key features of functions. Remember, yesterday we did the intercepts, domain, and range. So today, we're looking at our third key feature, positive and negative intervals. So let's start by defining our terms. Positive intervals lie above, that's the key there, lie above the x-axis. And then negative intervals lie below the x-axis. So let's take a look at a diagram here. So I have my coordinate plane drawn out. So anything above the x-axis, here's our x-axis, anything above it, anything that falls in this yellow region, that would be positive. And then anything that is below would be negative. So down here, below the x-axis, anything that falls down in this green area would be negative. Some key notes here. You're always going to use x values. Always use x values. You're ignoring the y for positive and negative intervals. So always use x values when writing your intervals. And another key note is only use brackets if graph is specifically closed. So it would have a dot. It would end with that closed circle. Otherwise, you're using parentheses. Okay, so let's look at a couple examples here. So we can define our success criteria. So what did we learn in our notes? First of all, you're looking at your x-axis, and if it's above, it's positive, and if it's below, it's negative. So the portion of the graph above the x-axis is positive, and then the portion of the graph below the x-axis is negative. All right, and then once you determine what's above and what's below, then you're ready to write your interval. So when you're writing your interval, you're only using x values. Only use x values when writing intervals. So just ignore all those y values. And then lastly, we need to know if we use parentheses or brackets. So you're going to use parentheses like that, unless it's a closed circle, specifically a closed circle. Like that. Then, if that's the case, you're going to use brackets. Okay. Let's try this. Here's my first example for you. So step one, I'm going to determine the portion above the x-axis. So I'm going to use yellow for that. So that's above the x-axis. That's above the x-axis. So that's going to be my positive intervals. Okay, now I'm going to determine the negative intervals. So I'm looking at my x-axis. Anything below it, that's negative. Okay. All right, now I need to determine my x values. That's step 3. So I'm looking from this point to this point. That's the positive. That's my first positive interval. So this point right here, remember, only use x values. I'm going to ignore all these y values. I'm going to find what is the x value right here. That would be -5. And then it ends here at -1. Open circle, parenthesis. That is also a parenthesis. It has to be specifically an actual closed dot to get the bracket, just like this one up here. So even though it goes through, like this is different than the domain and range, what we did yesterday. In positive and negative intervals, when it goes through like this, that's a parenthesis. Now let's do this one. So this is my next positive interval. So it's going to start at 2. Remember, only x values, 2. And then end at 6 here. That's going to be a parenthesis. That's specifically a filled in closed circle, so that gets a bracket. Let's do the negative. There's only one negative interval. This is one continuous piece, so this is just counted as one interval. So it starts at -1, ends at 2, both parentheses. All right, let's do another one. Next example. I'm going to find the positive and negative. I'm going to start with positive and use my yellow highlighter here. So here's my first interval there. And here's my second. This is one continuous piece, so this is just one. So I'm looking from here to here in my x values. So this goes from -3 to 0. Both parentheses. All right, so this one starts at 3 and that arrow means it never ends. It keeps going on and on infinitely. So when I'm looking at my x-axis, the further I go to the left, that's getting closer and closer to negative infinity. The arrow means it keeps going to infinity, and this direction is negative. This direction, going to the right, is going to positive infinity. So really, the more I go this way, I'm getting closer and closer to positive infinity. That also gets a parenthesis. All right, let's look at negative. That would be this piece here. Only one interval there. And then this piece there. So let's start with this one. It's going from 4 to 3, or -4 to -3. -4, that's specifically a closed circle, so that gets a bracket. And then the -3 gets the parenthesis. And then this piece is going from 0 to 3. Both parentheses. All right, let's look at some more examples. Let's start with this one. Okay, so I'm going to identify the positive intervals. Anything above the x-axis is positive. And I'm only looking at the x-axis only for the x values here. So here would be 1, 2, 3. These are negative. And 1. Okay. So let's look at this piece first. Arrow means it keeps going. Remember, this way would be negative infinity, and this way would be positive infinity. So this arrow keeps going to the left, to the positive, or to the negative infinity direction. It's going this way. So negative infinity, and then it ends at -3. Negative infinity to -3. And then they'd both be parentheses. Okay, now this one is going from 1 all the way this way to the positive infinity. So 1 to positive infinity, and those are both parentheses. Now we can do the negative. I'm going to do this in green. This is one continuous piece, so only one interval there, from -3 to +1. Yesterday we talked about x-intercepts also being called zeros. So when you see zeros, good review from yesterday, we're just looking for x-intercepts. So x is going to equal -3 and +1. Okay? All right, let's go to this one. Positive. Anything above the x-axis there. Remember, going to the left, that's negative infinity. Going to the right, that's positive infinity. So that's going to be, let's see, this is 1, 2, negative, 1, 2, 3. Okay. So -2 to 0 would be that first positive interval, both parentheses, and then 3 on to positive infinity for this piece here. Negative, anything below the x-axis is negative. So you're gonna go negative infinity to -2. This arrow means it's going to keep going into the negative infinity direction, so it's negative infinity to -2. And then we have 0 to 3. Then your zeros would be -2, 0, and 3. Okay, so that concludes the notes. So go ahead and go into in your Google Classroom under classwork and do the worksheet for practice. So you've got just 4 problems to do.